I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. We live in contentious times. Is it possible to disagree without fighting? Our first guest describes an airplane trip. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Goheen is an infectious disease expert at Yale University. The person sitting next to her was a vaccine skeptic. How did their lengthy conversation proceed without hard feelings?
Our show today is about bridges, not battles. Some podcasts have become platforms for conflict, not communication.
How can we talk with, not at, people who see things differently? Can braver angels show us a path forward?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, can you disagree without fighting?
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, a randomized controlled trial has just turned familiar advice on its head. Numerous experts have told us over the years that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. No doubt that's what the researchers who conducted a study of exercise and intensive reduction of cardiovascular risk factors were expecting. They recruited 513 older volunteers who did not have dementia. These people did have high blood pressure or a family history of dementia. The investigators assigned these volunteers to a supervised exercise group, a group that got intensive blood pressure and cholesterol medicine, a group that did both exercise and medication, and a group that got neither. People took cognitive tests both at the beginning and end of the 2-year study. There were no statistically significant differences among the groups with respect to improvement in cognitive function. That doesn't mean we should give up on exercise or blood pressure control, but it suggests we shouldn't expect more than they can deliver.
For decades, doctors assumed that organ systems such as the heart, the brain, and the lungs were devoid of microorganisms, unless there was some infection. Although we've known that there is a flourishing community of bacteria, fungi, and viruses in the digestive tract, we were unaware of the microbiome throughout the body. A new study published in Microbiology Spectrum has uncovered a potentially helpful bacterium called Dolocigranulum pigrum in the lungs. People who have higher levels of this microorganism in lung tissue seem less likely to experience symptoms of long COVID. The authors of this research suggest that this particular bacterium seems to help with recovery from viral infections such as SARS-CoV-2 or influenza. This study is reminiscent of some bacteriophage research. Viruses that attack specific pathogenic bacteria can be helpful to human health. This approach calls to mind the old proverb, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Perhaps Dolocigranulum pigrum is a friendly bacterium that can help the body fight off flu and COVID viruses.
Middle-aged women are less susceptible to heart attacks and strokes than men, at least until after they go through menopause. A new study analyzed data on women who went through menopause before age 40. The database included more than 3,500 black women and 6,500 white women, with 163,000 person years of follow-up. Women who went through premature menopause were about 40% more likely to develop coronary heart disease. The authors suggest they may deserve more intense prevention efforts.
You've heard of the DASH diet, which stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. This eating pattern has a lot of vegetables, nutrient-dense fruit, low-fat dairy products, and whole grains. It limits salt, sugar, and saturated fats. Another popular eating plan is the Mediterranean diet. It, too, is rich in produce and limits meat and sugar. It also emphasizes fish and olive oil as the preferred fat. A mashup of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet is known as the MIND diet. This stands for Mediterranean Dash Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. Several studies have looked at whether people following this eating pattern can slow cognitive decline. A new analysis of the Framingham Heart Study offspring cohort has found that people who came closest to following the MIND diet retained more gray matter in their brains over the course of 12 years. The cohort included 1,647 middle-aged and older people who filled out questionnaires several times during the study. These anatomical changes are promising, but we'd like to see data on cognitive performance before reaching conclusions on the value of the MIND diet against dementia. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. On the People's Pharmacy, we interview experts about a wide range of health topics to bring you the latest research. Sometimes the scientists we talk to don't agree with each other. These days, it can be difficult to have conversations with people who don't share your views.
Today, we're going to talk about some topics that can feel profoundly personal. Vaccines, trust in medicine, trust in each other. We'll try to do it the way we think this should be done. Honestly, carefully, and with real respect for the fact that people arrive at their beliefs for reasons that matter to them. We're not here to tell you what to think. We are hoping to explore how we might interact respectfully. We hope you'll listen with an open mind and open heart in the spirit of the show, listening to hear and understand, even when you may not agree.
To help us with this, we turn to Dr. Morgan Goheen. She serves as faculty instructor in the section of infectious diseases within the Department of Internal Medicine at Yale School of Medicine.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Morgan Goheen.
Thank you.
Dr. Goheen, we'd like to know a little bit about you. It's our understanding that you have a medical degree as well as a doctorate, a PhD in infectious disease. How did you get interested in infectious diseases on top of your medical degree?
Well, actually, it all kind of started by virtue of growing up in the middle of nowhere, Montana, which I'm sure you weren't expecting me to say that. But the town that I grew up in western Montana, happened to be home to Rocky Mountain Laboratories, which is an outpost of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So as a high school kid looking for a summer job, the lab there actually offered amazing opportunities to local kids to get real exposure to world-class science. And certainly that was all infectious disease themed. And that just really stuck with me ever since I was a teenager, and having role models in the community who were infectious disease experts. So I forged ahead with college, and then, became also more interested in the humanitarian side of infectious disease work and pursuing a medical degree so that I could do both patient care and translational bench to bedside research, trying to address infectious diseases that affect people all over the world.
Well, we understand that your special expertise is in malaria. We don't have a big problem with malaria in the U.S., but it's a huge killer, especially of children worldwide.
Yes, that's correct. I think, many people today are mistaken if they think malaria is a disease of the past. It absolutely is a disease still infecting hundreds of millions of people across the world annually and killing, as you mentioned, on the order of 500,000 children, or primarily children under 5 that succumb to disease. Those are big numbers that we're still dealing with in today's era.
Dr. Goheen, we understand that you were on an airplane not too long ago and you got into a very interesting conversation with the person next to you who happened to be a vaccine skeptic. Would you be kind enough to tell us a little bit about that conversation, how it got started, and what happened during the course of your plane ride?
Yeah, absolutely. I think many of us find ourselves at times in small talk conversations with someone sitting next to us. I have to say, of late, with everything going on politically and lots of charged conversations around vaccines, the leadership of health and human services in this country, funding for infectious disease research or other medical research. It's definitely on my mind these days. I never know what the reaction is going to be if somebody asks what you do for a living, and the answer is, well, I'm an infectious disease physician. That can go many ways. And the particular person I was sitting next to, had a lot of questions about things they'd heard in the news regarding, or I guess in their news circles regarding, for instance, the origin of Lyme disease. We were flying out of Connecticut after all, or the virtue of getting vaccinated. And the conversation really just took many different turns, but was really focused on lots of misunderstandings from this individual about certain infectious diseases. And I was doing my best to stay engaged and stay and keep them engaged to have a real conversation about the truth.
I can imagine that might have been a challenge. What is there about the origin of Lyme disease?
Well, I hadn't even heard this. This particular person was telling me that it was a bioterrorism weapon released in the state of Connecticut in Lyme, Connecticut, and that's why it was referred to as Lyme disease. I had to tell them I've never heard that, and I'm someone who's been trained in infectious diseases and having been in this career path for 15 years. So it's I find it hard to believe that that would be the case. And then I kind of walked through a lot of what is known about the origins of some of these diseases and the fact that it's by no means a disease linked specifically to Lyme, Connecticut, old Lyme, Connecticut, that is simply where the epidemiologic puzzle came in to full view, and then hence the name of linking the disease syndrome with the infectious origins, bacterial origins spread via ticks. But also, kind of trying to further understand where they had heard this and why was this compelling to them when it makes absolutely no sense to develop a bioterrorism weapon that is spread via ticks that primarily infects people trying to spend time outdoors and isn't a deadly disease.
Exactly. It does not make sense as a bioterrorism weapon. And there's still a lot we have to learn about it as, Borrelia burgdorferi infection. There's still a lot of things we don't know about Lyme disease that we'd like to learn, but, it's an infection.
But I do wonder about the source of some of these. In some cases, we'll call them rumors. In other cases, clearly an effort to mislead the public. And I'm assuming this gentleman was getting a lot of his information from the internet. What were some of the other issues that came up during your conversation?
Yeah, he was definitely, I think you're correct, getting his sources from the internet or other forums, social media forums, potentially. Other things that came up, we talked about COVID and the pandemic, of course, something everyone experienced in this country and the world, and experienced in very different ways. And his frustrations about vaccine mandates early on and how violating that felt to him because of fears about getting vaccinated, potential consequences that were being touted again online. And I shared very openly and frankly about my experiences on the other side, working in the hospital nonstop, taking care of patients who were dying at alarming rates and dying by themselves, and the trauma of all that healthcare workers and families experienced. And for me, the vaccine was a lifesaver, and it was an ability to regain normalcy with some sort of protection for community and ourselves. So I think it was helpful for me too to have an honest conversation with him and admit my own biases in terms of my belief in science and faith in the medical system, and how that has colored my tendency to perhaps not initially have heard as loudly as it should have been heard people saying that the pandemic shutdown was causing real economic havoc for many people, and being able to talk about these things without yelling at each other. It was, I hope, a good experience for both of us.
Well, I'm curious how you parted, because clearly you had two very different perspectives. One where we'll perhaps oversimplify by calling your planemate, the person who is sitting next to you, an anti-vaxxer, and you, obviously, as an infectious disease expert, were supporting the science and suggesting that the vaccine made a huge difference. So how did you end up leaving after this rather, I'm sure, emotional conversation?
Yeah, it was interesting, actually. And we were both very respectful. He even at one point said, you're probably right about many of these conspiracies and things. He ultimately was essentially saying, I trust your expertise. However, it's also kind of fun to think of all these conspiracies, and that's literally how he put it. It's fun. It's more fun to have a conspiracy story behind some of these things. I mean, maybe not exactly in relation to COVID vaccines. That's clearly wasn't a fun experience for him. But with the origin of Lyme, for example, it was fun for him to think about a giant conspiracy behind it all.
You're listening to Dr. Morgan Goheen, faculty instructor in the section of infectious diseases in the Department of Internal Medicine at Yale School of Medicine. She's a physician scientist focusing on malaria transmission in sub-Saharan Africa.
After the break, we'll find out how vaccines work.
How can infectious disease experts help people understand the benefits and the risks of vaccines?
Conversations based on mutual respect can help build trust and understanding.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace.
Last year, I went through many different life changes. I needed to take a pause and examine how I was feeling in the inside to better show up for the ones who need me to be my best version of myself.
When you're navigating life's changes, Talkspace can help. Talkspace is the #1 rated online therapy, bringing you professional support from licensed therapists and psychiatry providers that you can access anytime, anywhere.
Living a busy life, navigating a long-distance relationship, becoming a first stepfather, Talkspace made all of those journeys possible. I could speak with my therapist in the office. I could speak with my therapist in the comfort of my home. I was never alone.
Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance, no problem. Now get $80 off your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Sonu, an FDA-approved drug-free treatment for nasal congestion and runny nose, using sound instead of steroids. More at getsonu.com. That's getsonu.com.
If you've ever bitten your tongue at a big family gathering, felt your blood pressure rise when a colleague said something you just couldn't accept, or found yourself dreading a conversation you knew was coming, this show is for you.
In this moment, even topics that once felt straightforward, like what to eat to maintain good health, have become flashpoints. Some of our discussion today touches on topics people feel strongly about. That's why we wanted to have this conversation. Is it possible to disagree without being disagreeable?
Today on the People's Pharmacy, we're bringing you two guests with very practical wisdom to share. Dr. Morgan Goheen is an infectious disease expert who recently found herself on a long flight seated next to a vaccine skeptic. Rather than arguing or shutting down, she did something harder. She listened, and something unexpected happened. They had a respectful exchange of perspectives. Dr. Goheen wrote about the experience.
We'll also hear from Dr. Laura Gilliam, a psychologist and couples therapist who works with Braver Angels. This organization has been quietly and thoughtfully helping Americans on opposite sides of difficult issues actually talk to one another, which of course also means listening.
We'll be honest with you. We have our own perspectives on some of these issues, but we think that learning to have a respectful dialogue with curiosity and even kindness is a skill we can all utilize.
We are talking with Dr. Morgan Goheen, an infectious disease expert teaching in the Department of Internal Medicine at the Yale School of Medicine. She also has a position at the Yale School of Public Health in the Epidemiology of Microbial Diseases Department. Her research is on mosquitoes and malaria transmission. Dr. Goheen is also a Public Voices Fellow of the Op-Ed Project in partnership with Yale University.
Dr. Goheen, I have a confession to make, and I apologize to our listeners because I've told them this story many times in the past, but I was a victim of polio when I was about 3 years of age, between 2 and 3, and I was, I will say, locked away in a polio ward at the Philadelphia Children's Hospital, what's known as the
Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Now, we should make a note, Joe, that this was before there was a polio vaccine, because you're old.
I am old, and so I caught polio probably at the end of 1947, maybe 1948, and it was really a horrific experience for a little kid who goes from being, with his parents in a wonderful, loving situation, supportive, to being in traction in a hospital ward with kids dying around me, unable to move, and these ghostly beings in white coats and masks who didn't want to touch me because they were afraid. Nobody really knew very much at that point about polio and how it was transmitted. And my parents could come once every week or every 2 weeks, but they wouldn't be able to touch me. They wouldn't even be able to come into the ward. They had to stay at the far end and peer through a tiny little window and wave at me. And the nurses would say, "Oh, there are your parents, Joey, wave at them." Well, that was a scarring experience, as you can well imagine. That doesn't happen anymore in the United States. It still happens some places around the world. But tell us how the polio vaccine changed everything and how a bunch of other vaccines, whether it was pertussis, which I also caught as a child, or measles or mumps or rubella or hepatitis or all of these other very serious conditions, have been changed thanks to vaccines.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your story. And I can only imagine how traumatizing that was and how much that stuck with you, obviously. I mean, I think that exactly to your point, these are things that we're so fortunate we don't have to experience anymore. Being locked away in a polio ward, losing family members to pertussis, measles, hepatitis, everything that you mentioned, we now have these amazing tools in the form of vaccines to prevent disease. And we've had the ability to live our lives relatively carefree in the sense that over the past several decades, as these vaccines have become so commonplace, these diseases and their spread has been completely curtailed in this country. And that in some ways lends itself now to the ability of people to say that they are unnecessary and not needed because we just haven't had to deal with them. And I think we're now entering an era, unfortunately, where there's obviously enough people starting to question their utility that if population vaccine levels fall below sort of what is required for herd immunity, we begin to see spread of things we never thought we would have to deal with again, such as measles, which we've all been hearing about in the news.
Dr. Goheen, I wonder if we could just take a moment or two to do a very brief primer on how vaccines work, because after all, they're not magic, but this is part of your expertise.
Sure. Well, there are different types of vaccines in the sense that sometimes we use attenuated, or rather, that would be the scientific term, sort of less infectious or not dangerous forms of pathogens that can't cause actual disease to expose people to the pathogen, or sometimes it's a mere protein of a pathogen that we are exposing people to. And the basic premise of any vaccine is to educate your body's immune system so that it develops antibodies and cellular responses and memorizes these responses, in essence, such that if it ever were to see a real form of the pathogen, it has the ability to ramp up your immune system and protect yourself from disease complications.
Dr. Goheen, the idea that there is this very strong anti-vaccine movement, some of it's based on religious tenets, some of it's based on the fact that I don't want the government telling me what to do. Some is based on a kind of anti-science, anti-medicine. I don't believe the FDA. I don't trust the NIH. I don't trust the CDC. But what would be the consequences if measles took hold again, and rubella, German measles, and RSV, and diphtheria, and tetanus, and chickenpox? When we were kids, there was no vaccine. And so a lot of kids caught chickenpox, and now we think maybe some people are getting Alzheimer's disease because of the chicken pox that they had as children, that herpes virus. So if a lot of people stopped getting vaccines, what would be the consequence?
Yeah, well, then certainly we would see spread of these diseases again. And for some people, as you mentioned, for example, chicken pox or measles, it used to be a disease that many children had. And for most people, an uncomfortable couple of weeks and recovery. But there are long-term consequences potentially of these infections. And you never know. Also, there's always a small percentage of people who don't have a simplistic infection and people die. So there's always going to be some portion of the population that suffers immense consequences, even if for most people the idea is it's maybe not a big deal. And I mean, on a purely economic level, then we're also talking about hospitals becoming more full when they're already pushed to their limits in terms of taking care of populations in the winter with COVID, with flu, with RSV, as you mentioned. We talk about having to shut schools down to stop a measles outbreak, things like that I think no one wants to relive those experiences of the COVID pandemic if they don't have to. And the thing is, we have the ability to prevent that.
One other thing, Dr. Goheen, that I think a lot of people don't consider is that some of these diseases can cause trouble for an unborn infant if the mother comes down with the disease. I'm thinking specifically of a disease called rubella, and the vaccination against it is they put it all together with measles and mumps. So it's the MMR vaccine against measles, mumps, and rubella. We used to call it German measles back before we had a vaccine against it. And it can cause serious birth defects if the mother is exposed to this disease that, people at that time before vaccines didn't think of as particularly serious, except for a pregnant woman. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think you're right. And what I didn't mention about what happens if vaccines are no longer commonly used, the most vulnerable amongst our population are the ones who are going to suffer the worst consequences. And that includes infants, and of course, pregnant women or other people with immunocompromising conditions. I think many of us even have family members these days who would be considered immunocompromised if someone's undergoing cancer therapy or who has had an organ transplant or is on immunomodulating medication for an autoimmune disease. There's many forms of immunocompromise that we don't even think about. And these are segments of the population who are going to be at extreme risk because they may not be able to get a vaccine, depending on the type of vaccine it is, or because their immune system can't mount that appropriate memory response to protect them, even if they did have the vaccine.
Dr. Goheen, you can't watch television these days without seeing commercials for prescription medications. And a lot of those medications are for conditions like psoriatic arthritis and rheumatoid arthritis and ulcerative colitis. And a lot of the medications that are being advertised mention during the side effect part that it may make infections worse. And, sometimes those infections can be life-threatening, or even in some cases, they may cause cancer. I'm assuming that means they're affecting the immune system in some way and not necessarily a good way. I mean, yes, it may be helpful for that particular condition, but it may have other consequences. Any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. You said it. There are consequences, and many times these medications are needed because there's a balance to be struck in damping down someone's own immune system in the case of an autoimmune infection or sorry, not infection, an autoimmune disease process. But that comes with consequences such as even COVID, not being able to mount an appropriate response and clear the virus for COVID for some people on, for example, anti-B cell therapies, or having to consider whether someone has traveled internationally in the past and potentially been exposed to tuberculosis in the past, such that now if they're on particular immunomodulating medications, they could experience a flare-up of disease. These are things we have to consider all the time as infectious disease experts, and we do work with immunocompromised people quite frequently.
Dr. Goheen, I'm wondering, as we wrap up our conversation with you today, how could infectious disease specialists such as yourself help people better understand the benefits and risks of vaccines?
Well, I think it requires time for a conversation, which I think was definitely what I took home from my prolonged conversation on the airplane earlier. And getting people to trust you and to have us respect each other and have people on, I don't want to say the other side, I don't like calling things different sides, but with different perspective, coming to realize that I'm not the enemy, I'm not out to get you. I have no ulterior motive other than trying to protect the population and doing my best to be part of research teams and patient care teams to keep people healthy. And that I hope we can have more real conversations to address people's concerns so that the questions they do bring up aren't brushed aside, but are treated respectfully. And hopefully they can similarly respect all of the expertise and training that those of us in my profession are trying to offer.
Dr. Morgan Goheen, thank you very much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
You've been listening to Dr. Morgan Goheen, an infectious disease expert teaching in the Department of Internal Medicine at the Yale School of Medicine. She also has a position at the Yale School of Public Health in the Epidemiology of Microbial Diseases Department. Her research is on mosquitoes and malaria transmission in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Goheen is also a Public Voices Fellow of the Op-Ed Project in partnership with Yale University.
You know, Terry, I think a lot of people have forgotten what it was like to fear polio or rubella, German measles, or even something like pertussis, whooping cough.
That's right. And when you don't see it, it can easily imagine that you don't need to worry about it.
Well, I think it is also important to acknowledge adverse reactions to vaccines. I mean, there are benefits and there are risks. But the long-term consequences of things like, chickenpox that might lead to Alzheimer's disease, I think sometimes we forget that as well.
Definitely worth thinking about.
And there are a lot of people who are immunocompromised, people who are receiving cancer therapy. They really do need to have everybody vaccinated for some of these conditions that could be life-threatening for them.
That is so true.
After the break, we're going to talk with Dr. Laura Gilliam, a clinical psychologist who is active with an organization called Braver Angels.
Braver Angels is a volunteer-led organization striving to bridge partisan divides.
One of the basic principles is to treat the other person in the dialogue with honesty, dignity, and respect.
You need to listen to understand their perspective instead of just thinking about how you can jump in and win the argument. Listening like that is hard.
Even though a lot of people have been yelling and arguing with each other, many find that a true dialogue is a revelation.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Sonu, an FDA-approved drug-free treatment for nasal congestion and runny nose, using sound instead of steroids. More at getsonu.com. That's getsonu.com.
Today, we're talking about how to have conversations with people who don't agree with us. How do you do that? Can you listen closely to what they're saying and what they mean? Can you reflect it back to them so that they'll know you heard them and you get to find out if you actually understood what they meant? All this takes practice and patience and curiosity and respect. We can't build trust in an instant, but over a long or repeated conversation, we might make a good start.
We just spoke with Dr. Morgan Goheen about her experience on a long flight talking with someone who disagreed with her. Many of us dread finding ourselves in such a situation, but learning to talk with and listen to people with whom we disagree is a vital skill. That's why we turn now to Dr. Laura Gilliam. She is a licensed clinical psychologist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, a state coordinator for Braver Angels, and a member of the Central North Carolina Alliance of Braver Angels.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Laura Gilliam.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Dr. Gilliam, we just spoke with an infectious disease expert, Dr. Morgan Goheen, about her rather intriguing conversation on an airplane trip in which she was sitting next to someone who was a vaccine skeptic. And, Dr. Goheen, by being an infectious disease expert, believes in vaccines, and her seatmate did not. And yet, at the end of this trip, they were not fighting. They actually were very respectful. So the question for you is, here we are, living in polarized times where it's not just politics, it's not just health, it's just about everything. And a lot of people are saying, you're either with me or you're against me, with very little room for compromise or empathy. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how this organization you're affiliated with, Braver Angels, tries to break down those barriers?
Be glad to. Yeah, I am. My background is in clinical psychology. I am a psychotherapist in private practice, and I do a whole lot of couples therapy or couples counseling. And I was interested when Braver Angels started in about 2016, really. And I heard about it. I was immediately interested in part because it was one of its founders is a known marriage and family therapist, Bill Doherty, whom I knew professionally, not personally, but I knew of him. And I was really interested because I do a whole lot of, as I said, couples therapy, and the principles of couples and family therapy are the basis of some of what Braver Angels does.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about those principles, please?
Yes. Sort of the basic principle is treat the other person that you disagree with, whether you're in a marriage or, in a country. Treat that person with respect, listen to understand them, and speak not to win the argument necessarily, but to be heard, to share your views and be heard, and you give them the same respect to hear them.
Marriage counseling has to be challenging because a lot of times it's like, she said, blah, blah, blah. No, he did, blah, blah, blah. And, it's like, I'm so angry. Mm-hmm. And they're so ready to jump in and tell you why that person is wrong and why they're right, that it's hard to listen, and especially with respect. How do you help people do that?
Yeah, well, that's there's a lot to that question. We all believe we are right. We tend to believe we are right, especially when we're mad. We want to win the argument and at least convince the other person that of our rightness. One of the kind of underpinnings of Braver Angels is something we call the Braver Angels Way, and I brought it with me, and I can read it. It's got, let's see, 8 statements. I don't necessarily need to go through all of them, but
No, but if you could just summarize the points.
yeah. Well, I want to just read the first 2, if that's
Okay.
okay. So I think they are among the most important. We state our views freely and fully without fear. So we don't censor ourselves. We bring people across the political spectrum together to talk in a facilitated way with some ground rules. So one of the ground rules is we don't worry that we're going to be told we're wrong or that we're bad for saying something or believing something. The second one, which goes with that, is that we treat people who disagree with us with honesty, dignity, and respect. So stating our views freely and fully without fear does not mean blasting people with our anger. We have to state our views with respect for the listener.
You must have some special way of setting up those parameters because this is not the way things are working out in the wider world at this time.
That is true. On the other hand, people really, we hear this all the time within Braver Angels and outside it, that people are really hungry for the chance to talk with people respectfully and without being scolded or attacked. So people want to do it. So the ones that come, to our events typically already have that desire. And so we set the ground rules. We have some very structured workshops where there's a moderator, and the moderator really enforces the guardrails so that people are, focused on answering a particular question. Often it's reflecting on what your own side believes and, what policies and values are important on your side and what you have concerns about on your own side. So that humility about your own side is really important.
One of the things that has always fascinated me in these kinds of conversations where one person has a certain perspective and the other person has a very different perspective, and it can be in a couples counseling situation, it's that you have to listen really attentively to what the other person is saying and then reflect back to them what you've heard. And that forces you to actually listen instead of trying to formulate your rebuttal. Can you talk a little bit about reflecting back?
Yes, that is absolutely right. And that is something that we teach people. We have, in addition to bringing workshops and events where we bring people together to talk across differences, we have some workshops where people specifically learn good communication skills. And some of that is the reflective listening, active listening that you just mentioned. So yes, the first step is to listen. The second step is to acknowledge or, summarize maybe what you heard, see if you got it right. And then if you get agreement, you can ask if you can share a different perspective or, here's something that I have learned. And then you go ahead and share your perspective.
That definitely sounds like it could be useful in a lot of different situations. But in different situations, you don't start with the agreement that you can state your views freely and fully without fear. I think a lot of people are afraid to speak out, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's at church or in the PTA meeting or something. And other people are not at all afraid, which is sometimes a problem.
Yes. Yes. And so, these guidelines are not right. They're not the norm for most of our settings. But we are trying to, one of the things that Braver Angels is trying to do is trying to change our norms. so that we can, it is okay to disagree even with people on your own side, because that's often where people are most afraid to speak, is they're afraid of being canceled or shamed by their own side. So yes, and then there are other people who really enjoy being very stating their views very aggressively and hostilely.
Well, let's stop right there because, I think a lot of people go, well, I'm dreading getting together with the family. It may be at Thanksgiving. It may be some family event. It's like, oh, Uncle Charlie, he's going to say bad things. He's going to be so aggressive. He's going to be so unpleasant. Maybe I just won't go. So how do you attend, whether it's a family event or whether it's something at your religious affiliation where, you know that there's going to be a cousin or Uncle Charlie who's going to want to fight and he's going to want to, establish his point of view and plant his flag very forcefully. So how do you deal with situations like that and not just retreat and avoid them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, first of all, you have to know when it's worth having a discussion and when it's worth letting it pass. And group conversations, say around the dinner table with family, that's one of the trickiest settings for having political conversations. And, usually it's much better if you want to stand up if you want to say something to share your perspective that's different than Uncle Charlie's, it's much better to pull him aside and say, "Could we talk about this? I'm really curious to know how you're thinking about this." So you start with curiosity. That's often a really good strategy. If you're in a group setting, you have to understand that people are going to take these roles where they, are going to be the gladiator in the conversation, and you have to be prepared for that. We have a whole workshop about politics and families.
Oh, that sounds like people might be very interested in it. We asked you just a little bit about Braver Angels, but we didn't give you a chance to tell us how it got started.
Yes, it started after Trump's first election, where we had this situation where half the country was elated and half the country was devastated. And a few friends, including Bill Doherty and another man, David Blankenhorn and David Lapp, were all friends and started talking to each other about this situation and what could we do about this. And they decided, the two Davids decided they would do an experiment and bring together I forget how many, 8 or 10 Trump voters and 8 or 10 Hillary Clinton voters, and for a weekend to do something. And then that's where Bill Doherty came in and designed some structured exercises for them. And the weekend was transformative for everybody. It was just a huge success. And so they decided to build on it from there.
I wonder if you could give us some of the do's and don'ts about, respectful communication and what to do if someone gets angry and wants to fight.
Sure. So as I said before, if you start with a question and a respectful curiosity, and also, okay, so respecting curiosity is one thing. Also signaling that you already know that you disagree. So, I know you and I see these things differently. I'm really curious to know how you are thinking about, the conflict in Iran. And so you listen, you say, I hear you say, I think what you're saying is this, is that right? And then you say, well, as you probably know, I see this a little differently. Is it okay if I share my perspective? So you're communicating respect and asking for permission. If they get angry, you could try reflecting the emotion. It sounds like this is you really feel strongly about this. And sometimes that acknowledging will de-escalate. They will calm down. They will say, yes, this is why I feel so strongly. And you can do some more listening. Sometimes you have to do more listening than speaking.
Where did the concept of braver angels arise? How did that happen?
It was originally named after better angels, the better angels of our nature in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It was changed to braver angels for a couple of reasons, and I'll just state the main reason is that it takes courage to engage with people really disagree with you.
Dr. Gilliam, I'm curious, is there a time you can tell us about when you watched a conversation unfold and the Braver Angels way was able to help diffuse a volatile situation?
Well, I can tell you a couple of things. One is that at almost every workshop, people end up, we ask for what their takeaway was, and they say, boy, I came into this setting really nervous to talk to those people on the other side. And yet I was amazed to find that there are reasonable, smart people that they're on the other political side, and that we actually have a lot in common. So that's kind of a general thing. A specific experience was a workshop with students at UNC Chapel Hill a long time ago, early in Braver Angels history, where the more liberal-leaning students were amazed to hear that the conservative-leaning students were afraid to share their views on campus. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of self-censorship on campuses, but they were really happy to talk with each other and learn what they were thinking.
That actually brings up another question, and that is, I think there are a lot of situations in which people practice self-censorship. They say, well, this person has just suggested something that makes me think they're completely opposed to my perspective, but I don't want to get into a fight with them, so I'm just going to be quiet and go away. That leaves us, we're not having a fight, but on the other hand, we're not really finding out why the other person might think the way they do. What would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, you always have to kind of weigh the pros and cons in the context you're in. But, I hope that, and I think that self-censorship is maybe getting to be a little bit less than it was in sort of the height of cancel culture. But I think there is always a way to share, to say, I have a little bit of a different perspective on that. Are you interested in hearing it? And that usually
and asking that question probably makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Dr. Gilliam, I'd like to describe a conversation that I had many years ago in a workshop setting in which we were being taught how to listen and reflect back on what we heard. And I was paired with a police officer. And this police officer was describing one of the more painful experiences of his life. He had just come back from Vietnam, where he had been in combat, and he was met with a lot of criticism and complaining and arguing. And it hurt him to the core. I mean, he was still living that pain 25, 30 years later. And I was one of those people who had protested the Vietnam War. I'm a Quaker. I'm a pacifist. I'm anti-war. So, as I'm listening to him, thinking about my background with regard to the Vietnam War and his background with regard to the combat that he experienced and the pain and the challenges of returning home. And I reflected to him what he had said to me and how much pain he had gone through and how angry he was as a result of that experience. And at the end, he was so astonished because he basically said, I thought you were one of those anti-war protesters. But man, you really understand me. You got it. You really captured what I went through. And he gave me a big hug. And I think we were both surprised and amazed that we had this very intimate and powerful conversation. And it was enlightening for him and for me. I don't know if that's a Braver Angels conversation or not, but all I know is that we both came away with new understanding and appreciation of the other person.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the things at the heart of both, good listening in general, and it comes up in couples counseling all the time, and in Braver Angels, when you really listen and really show that you heard and understand some of what the other person is expressing. That's really powerful.
Dr. Gilliam, there are a lot of perspectives in politics. There are a lot of perspectives when it comes to marriages that are kind of having some rough spots. But we haven't talked about the complicated disagreements over health. We started this conversation talking about the vaccine situation and how an infectious disease expert could have a respectful conversation with an anti-vaxxer. But there are so many aspects of health that have become polarized in the last couple of years. I'm just wondering your thoughts about, how do we interact with, let's say, our healthcare providers if we have a different perspective than they do? I don't want to take a statin. You must take a statin. So, that creates some interesting conversations. Or in the case of somebody who is totally opposed to the FDA or the CDC or the NIH, I don't trust the government anymore. I wouldn't do anything they recommend. How do we deal with health professionals in particular where there's an imbalance in power? The neurosurgeon is a super specialist, and who are we to ask questions?
Yeah, well, it is important to ask questions when it's your health. You need to have your questions answered, ideally within the time constraints. And I think it's really important for health professionals to treat patients' concerns and questions with respect. They should not be making their patients feel dumb for asking or wrong for asking.
Dr. Gilliam, what recommendations do you have for our listeners as they approach situations in which others may disagree?
I think it's really important to remember that we may disagree on some political issue, but at the end of the day, we are all Americans, at least, if we're talking about Americans, we are all human beings, and we are going to agree on things, disagree on some things, and we often come to our beliefs because of our life experiences, and not because we're, someone doesn't disagree because they're stupid or bad. They believe what they believe for a reason, and it's often more interesting to find out how they came to their beliefs than argue about those beliefs.
And so finally, what would you recommend if someone finds him or herself on an airplane and maybe arguing about health issues like vaccines or political issues or economic issues or anything? What's the best way to sit next to somebody on an airplane for a couple of hours and have a respectful conversation?
Yeah, well, I think it is finding your curiosity and your humility, and being willing to learn something. We don't have all the answers. None of us has all the answers. We haven't thought of every angle, and we can often get a more complex, complete view of something by hearing lots of different perspectives.
Dr. Gilliam, how would people learn more about Braver Angels, and what would you like them to know about Braver Angels?
Well, I'd like them to know that Braver Angels is really dedicated to rebuilding trust across political differences and trust in our institutions and practicing what we call courageous citizenship. And you can learn about Braver Angels by going to the website braverangels.org.
Dr. Laura Gilliam, thank you very much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Laura Gilliam, a licensed clinical psychologist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, a state coordinator for Braver Angels, and a member of the Central North Carolina Alliance of Braver Angels. This is an organization that's been encouraging Americans on opposite sides of difficult issues to talk with each other, employing respect, curiosity, and kindness. We spoke earlier with Dr. Morgan Goheen, an infectious disease expert at Yale School of Medicine.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
Today's show is number 1467. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's where you can share your comments about this episode. You can reach us through email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider. You'll find the podcast on our website on Monday morning.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you could sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also have regular access to information about our weekly podcast. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.